Chapter 7, Motorcycle Meeting. The questions that you will be thinking about are, at the beginning of the chapter, why do the children believe that both Arnold and the vice president are involved? Where did they discover the bug? It's not a real bug, not a cockroach. Remember, what they're referring to is like a microphone, something small, a small device where they were listening in. So where did they discover the bug? Why does the author compare the collar to a rattlesnake on page 69? Make sure you go back to 69 to refer to this, okay? Chapter 7, Motorcycle Meeting. Casey and Marshall froze behind the desk. They hardly breathed as they heard papers being moved above their heads. Then the shadow moved away. Casey heard the office door open, then close. She crawled from behind the desk and raced for the door. "What are you doing?" Marshall asked. "I want to see who that was," Casey hissed, "and what they stole off the president's desk." Casey slowly eased the door open. She stuck her head out, then back in like a red-headed turtle. "It's the vice president," Casey said. Marshall blinked. "So? She can go into the Oval Office if she wants," he said. "Come on," Casey said. "Let's follow her." Walking as quietly as possible, the kids sneaked after the vice president. She left the building and walked towards the employee parking lot. Casey and Marshall followed. When she sat on a bench and took out her cell phone, they hid behind some bushes. "What's she doing?" Marshall asked. "Talking on her phone again," Casey said. Suddenly they heard a roar. A motorcycle pulled up in front of the bench. When the driver removed his helmet, the kids saw that it was Arnold. The vice president stood up and slipped her cell phone into her pocket. From her bag, she took out a small package and handed it to Arnold. They spoke for a minute, then he put on his helmet and zoomed out of the parking lot. After a few seconds, the vice president hurried back into the building. "They must both be in on it," Casey said, stepping out from behind the bushes. "Whatever she took off the president's desk, she just gave it to Arnold. And he'll give it to Darla Darling," Marshall said. Casey nodded. "We know it now, but how do we prove it?" she asked. "I can't prove anything on an empty stomach," Marshall said. "Okay, come on," Casey said. "How can you eat? Don't you feel bad? I really like Arnold and the vice president." "I like them too," Marshall said. Then his stomach rumbled. In the president's kitchen, Casey and Marshall sat down at the table. Marshall peeled a banana and started to eat. George was lying on the counter next to the refrigerator. His bushy tail swept back and forth. Both kids watched George as he reached for a mouse refrigerator magnet. The magnet fell on the floor. In a flash, George pounced. He grabbed the mouse in his paws and began chewing on the plastic. "No, George," Casey said. "Spit it out." She got down on her knees and moved towards the cat. George jumped up and walked away. "Now, what did you do with that, silly?" "Magnet," Casey asked, looking at the floor. "Maybe it's in his mouth," Marshall said. He slipped behind George and grabbed him. Casey sat on the floor beside Marshall and tried to make George open his mouth. "Here it is," Marshall said. "It's stuck on his collar." He pulled the magnet loose and held it out to Casey. But she was examining George's collar. "How could a magnet stick to a plastic collar?" she asked. Slowly, she slid the collar around, studying it closely. Suddenly, Casey gasped. She yanked her hand away from the collar as if it were red hot. What? Marshall asked. With shaking hands, Casey unbuckled George's collar. She opened a drawer, laid the collar inside, and quietly slid the drawer shut. Then she scooted down next to Marshall again. Casey, are you going to tell me what's going on? Marshall asked. You look all funny. That plastic collar has a round metal thing on it, Casey whispered. That's what the magnet was sticking to. So, why do you look so weird? Marshall asked. That piece of metal is a bug, Casey said. A listening device. Marshall blinked about 7 times. So, someone bugged George? A cat is the spy in the White House? Casey nodded. George is usually with the president. That must be how the spy found out all the wedding stuff and reported it to Darla Darling, she said. But who did it? Marshall asked. Casey shrugged. It could be anyone who can get close enough to George, she said. The cat looked at Marshall and meowed. So, the snitch isn't Arnold or the vice president? Asked Marshall. It could still be one of them, Casey said, but I doubt it. They're both here all the time, so why would they have to bug George? But it could be anyone else who works here. Marshall groaned. What do we do now? I sure wish the president were here, he said. Well, he's not, but you just gave me a great idea, Casey said. We can pretend the president is here, and I think I know a way to make the spy come here too. Am I gonna like this? Marshall asked, looking worried. Casey beamed. You're gonna hate it. She opened the drawer, lifted out the collar, and carefully placed her hand over the little metal bug. Then she slid next to Marshall. Just go along with whatever I say, she whispered in his ear. Marshall gulped, staring at the collar. You mean we're gonna talk about that thing? Casey nodded. Pretend you're in a school play, she said. Oh, great, Marshall said. The last time I was in a play, I got so nervous I nearly puked. Well, no puking this time, Casey said. We have to sound normal. Are you ready? Marshall swallowed. I guess so, he muttered. He took her hand off the bug. Isn't it exciting that Mom and the president are eloping today? She said with her mouth near the collar. Casey nudged Marshall's foot and placed the collar in his lap. Marshall's mouth fell open. He stared at the collar as if it were a rattlesnake. Hint. He tried to swallow, but his mouth was dry. Casey kicked his foot again. She mouthed the words, Say something. Someone is listening. Marshall took a deep breath before he spoke into the collar. Yeah, but it's too bad they're not having their big wedding. I was really looking forward to all the cake and ice cream. Casey smiled at Marshall and took the collar back. They have to do it this way to make sure Darla Darling doesn't find out the new honeymoon spot, she said, speaking into the little listening device. What time are they eloping? Asked Marshall, talking. He had stopped stuttering. Casey could tell he was getting into it now. Casey glanced up at the kitchen clock. It was almost noon. 2 o'clock, she said, leaning over the collar. How are they getting there? Marshall asked, trying to stop himself from cracking up. In the president's private plane. Casey snatched the cat's collar out of Marshall's hands. The doesn't want anyone to recognize him, she said. He'll be in a taxi and wearing a baseball cap and dark glasses. Mom will have a red scarf over her hair. He's picking her up at the side entrance near those tall bushes. Marsh started to giggle, so Casey put the collar back in the drawer. That was so cool, Marshall said. I feel like we're in a James Bond movie. I don't think James Bond giggles, Casey said. Now, what do we do? Marshall asked. We wait till 2 o'clock, Casey said, and keep our fingers crossed that the spy overheard us and comes to see the president and Mom eloping. Casey told Marshall the rest of her plan. Marshall grinned. I like it, he said. Except for one thing. What happens when the spy gets here at 2 and there's no president and no taxi and no eloping? Casey looked at him blankly. Oh, she said. I didn't think of that. Marshall sighed. Good thing James Bond is here to help you. He stood up and reached for the phone. Here, he said. Call a taxi. Okay, so now go back to the questions at the beginning of the chapter. Why do the children believe that both Arnold and the vice president are involved? Remember, what did they see when they followed the vice president outside, and who pulled up? Where did they discover the bug? Remember, the bug is the listening device. Where did they find it? Why does the author compare the collar to a rattlesnake on page 69?